In March 1903, in a modest Victorian parlor in Springfield, Massachusetts, a professional photographer captured what appeared to be a tender family moment. 7-year-old Catherine Rose Miller sitting beside her beloved grandmother, Eleanor Miller, holding her hand and smiling sweetly at the camera. The photograph radiated warmth, love, and the simple joy of a child with her grandmother. For 118 years, this photograph remained in the Miller family's possession, passed down through 4 generations as a cherished memory of Catherine and Eleanor's special bond. But in 2021, when Catherine's great-great-granddaughter had the photograph professionally restored and digitized, the restoration specialist noticed something that had been invisible in the aged, faded original print. Something in grandmother Eleanor's appearance. Something in her posture, her skin tone, her eyes. Something that revealed a heartbreaking truth about what was actually happening in that parlor in March 1903. Subscribe now, because this photograph isn't a happy family portrait. It's something far more tragic, and the truth has been hiding in plain sight for 118 years. The photograph arrived at Jennifer Walsh's restoration studio in Boston in February 2021, submitted by Emma Richardson, a 34-year-old graphic designer who had inherited boxes of family photographs from her grandmother's estate. Emma wanted several important images professionally restored for preservation. The 1903 photograph showed a formal Victorian parlor, ornate wallpaper, heavy curtains, a velvet-upholstered chair. In the center sat a woman approximately 65 to 70 years old, Eleanor Miller, in an elaborate wooden chair. She wore a formal black Victorian dress with high collar, gray hair styled in a neat bun. Beside her, on a small cushioned stool, sat a young girl, Catherine Rose Miller, age 7, wearing a white dress with lace details and ribbons in her dark curly hair. Catherine was turned toward her grandmother, her small hand holding the older woman's hand, her face showing a genuine smile. The photograph was heavily faded, with significant water damage, cracks, and yellowing from 118 years of aging. The back bore faded ink, Eleanor and Catherine, March 1903. Jennifer had restored thousands of Victorian-era photographs during her 15 years in the business. She began her standard process, scanning the original at 15,000 dpy, then working digitally to restore contrast, remove damage, and recover lost details. As Jennifer worked on restoring the contrast and sharpness, she focused first on the faces, standard procedure to ensure the subjects looked their best. She enhanced Catherine's face. The bright eyes, genuine smile, childlike joy were beautifully preserved. Then she began working on grandmother Eleanor's face. And she stopped. Something was wrong with Eleanor's appearance. At first, Jennifer couldn't identify exactly what disturbed her. But as she increased the resolution and examined the image more carefully, she noticed several subtle details that made her increasingly uncomfortable. Eleanor's eyes had a fixed, glassy quality. They appeared to be looking at the camera, but there was no dimensional depth to them, no light reflection, no focus, just a flat, painted quality. Eleanor's skin showed a very subtle discoloration, a faint grayish-purple tone around her lips and jawline that Jennifer initially thought was photographic damage or shadow. But as she adjusted the color correction, the discoloration became more apparent and more disturbing. It wasn't shadow. It was something else. Eleanor's posture was unnaturally rigid. Victorian portrait photography required subjects to remain still for long exposures, but this was different. Eleanor's body had a stiffness, a weight distribution that suggested she wasn't supporting herself voluntarily. Her hands on the chair arms showed fingers in an odd, slightly curved position, not relaxed, Not tense, just frozen. Jennifer zoomed in on the background behind Eleanor's chair. There, barely visible in the enhanced restoration, was what appeared to be a support structure. Metal poles or braces positioned behind the chair, hidden by careful arrangement of Eleanor's dress and the chair's decorative details. Jennifer sat back from her monitor, her stomach tight with realization. She had seen these signs before. She had read about them in historical photography journals. She knew what they meant. Eleanor Miller wasn't alive in this photograph. The photograph showed a 7-year-old girl holding her dead grandmother's hand and smiling at the camera, completely unaware that the woman beside her had already passed away. This wasn't a family portrait. This was post-mortem photography, a Victorian practice of photographing the deceased to create final memorial images. And little Catherine, age 7, either didn't understand or hadn't been told that her grandmother was gone. Jennifer immediately contacted Emma Richardson to discuss her findings. The phone call was difficult. "Emma, I need to ask you some questions about your family history," Jennifer began carefully. "Specifically about the photograph of Eleanor and Catherine from 1903. What do you know about when it was taken?" Emma explained what she knew. "That's my great-great-grandmother Eleanor and her granddaughter Catherine, who would become my great-grandmother. Family stories say it was one of the last photographs of Eleanor before she died later in 1903. Catherine treasured this photograph her whole life. She said it was her favorite memory of her grandmother." Jennifer took a deep breath. "Emma, I need to tell you something that's going to be shocking. Based on my analysis of the restored image, I believe Eleanor was already deceased when this photograph was taken." There was a long silence. Then Emma's voice shaken. "What? That's not possible. Look at the photo. Catherine is holding her hand. Catherine is smiling. How could she be dead?" Jennifer explained what she had discovered. The fixed, glassy eyes, the subtle discoloration indicating early post-mortem lividity, the unnatural, rigid posture, the support structure barely visible behind the chair. She explained the Victorian practice of post-mortem photography, which was extremely common in the early 1900s, especially for elderly family members. Families would often pose deceased loved ones to appear alive, Jennifer continued gently. They'd dress them in their best clothes, position them carefully, sometimes paint their eyes open or onto closed eyelids, use support structures to hold them upright. The goal wasn't to deceive. Everyone present knew the person was deceased. It was about creating a final memorial image that showed them as they had been in life, not as a corpse. For many families, especially working-class families, this would be the only photograph they could afford. Emma was silent, processing. Finally, "But Catherine, she's smiling. She's 7 years old. Did she know?" "That's what makes this photograph particularly heartbreaking," Jennifer said. "I don't know if Catherine understood. Sometimes children were included in post-mortem photographs, specifically because their presence made the deceased appear more lifelike, more at peace. Sometimes children were told their grandparent or sibling was sleeping. Sometimes they knew but were told to smile for the photograph anyway. We may never know exactly what Catherine understood that day." Emma asked Jennifer to send her the enhanced restoration files. Over the following days, Emma researched her family history intensively, looking for records that could confirm or refute Jennifer's analysis. What Emma discovered in census records, death certificates, and family documents would confirm Jennifer's conclusion and reveal an even more heartbreaking story about why this particular photograph was taken, why Catherine was included, and what happened to the little girl afterward. The photograph wasn't just post-mortem photography. It was a final goodbye arranged by a desperate family dealing with tragedy, poverty, and the harsh realities of early 1900s life. And Catherine's smile, genuine and innocent, captured a 7-year-old girl's last moment of happiness before her entire world changed forever. Eleanor Miller had died on March 8, 1903. The photograph was taken on March 9, 1903, approximately 18 to 24 hours after her death, the day before her burial. And Catherine had no idea that when she smiled at the camera, holding her grandmother's cold hand, she was posing with a corpse. Emma's research into the Miller family history revealed a story of compounding tragedies that explained everything about the 1903 photograph. Eleanor Miller, born Eleanor Patterson in 1835, had married Robert Miller in 1855. They had 5 children between 1856 and 1868. By 1903, only one of those children was still alive: Martha Miller, Catherine's mother. Robert Miller died in 1897, leaving Eleanor a widow at age 62. She moved in with her daughter Martha, Martha's husband James, and their only child, Catherine, born in 1896. The family lived in a small rented house in Springfield, Massachusetts. James worked as a factory laborer. Money was perpetually tight. In January 1903, James died suddenly at age 34 from pneumonia, leaving Martha, age 32, widowed with a 7-year-old daughter and an elderly mother to support. Martha found work as a seamstress, but her income was barely sufficient to cover rent and food. In early March 1903, Eleanor fell ill. The family couldn't afford a doctor. Eleanor died at home on March 8, 1903, at age 68. Cause of death recorded: heart failure. Now Martha faced an impossible situation. She was 32 years old. Her husband had died 2 months earlier. Her mother had just died. She had a 7-year-old daughter. She had almost no money. She worked as a seamstress, earning subsistence wages. She had no other family. Eleanor had been her last living parent or sibling. Martha knew she couldn't afford to keep the house. She couldn't afford proper burial for her mother. She had no savings, no support network. And most heartbreakingly, she knew she probably couldn't keep Catherine. In early 1900s America, widowed working-class women with no family support faced brutal choices. Many were forced to place children in orphanages or give them to wealthier relatives, not because they didn't love them, but because survival required it. Martha made a desperate decision. Before Eleanor was buried, before Martha lost the house, before Catherine had to be told about being sent away, Martha spent a significant portion of her meager savings on something that seemed, to outsiders, absurd: a professional photographer. She arranged for Eleanor's body to be dressed in her best black dress, positioned in the parlor chair, supported by hidden braces. She had Eleanor's eyes painted open onto her closed eyelids, a common post-mortem photography technique. She dressed Catherine in her best white dress and told her, "We're having a special photograph taken with grandmother. Hold her hand and smile pretty for the camera." Catherine, at 7 years old, didn't understand death. She had been told grandmother was very sick and resting. She didn't question why grandmother was so still, so cold, so different. Children accept what adults tell them. Martha wanted one photograph, one final image showing 3 generations together, herself, her mother, and her daughter, before everything fell apart. But Martha herself couldn't bear to be in the photograph. She couldn't smile. She couldn't pretend. So the photograph shows only Eleanor and Catherine, the grandmother who had just died, and the granddaughter who would soon be sent away. 2 days after the photograph was taken, Eleanor was buried in a pauper's section of Springfield Cemetery. 3 weeks later, Martha placed Catherine with a more prosperous distant cousin's family in Hartford, Connecticut. Martha kept working as a seamstress in Springfield, sending what little money she could to contribute to Catherine's upkeep. Catherine never lived with her mother again. Catherine Rose Miller spent the remainder of her childhood with the Henderson family in Hartford, distant cousins who took her in more from obligation than affection. The Hendersons were not unkind, but they were not warm. They fed and clothed Catherine adequately, but made clear she was a burden, a charity case, someone to be grateful for their generosity. Catherine worked in the household from age 8, cleaning, cooking, childcare for the Hendersons' younger children. She attended school sporadically when her labor could be spared. Catherine saw her mother Martha only twice after being sent to Hartford. Martha visited in 1904 and again in 1907, staying only hours each time. Martha died in 1911 at age 40 from tuberculosis, alone in a boarding house in Springfield. She was buried in the same paupers section as Eleanor. Catherine, age 15, was not notified until weeks after the burial. Catherine left the Henderson household at age 17 in 1913, taking a position as a live-in domestic servant for a wealthy family in Hartford. She worked as a servant for 6 years, saving every penny possible. In 1919, at age 23, Catherine married Thomas O'Brien, a railroad worker she met through church. Thomas was 26, an Irish immigrant, kind but struggling financially. They had 4 children between 1920 and 1928. Margaret, James, Eleanor, named for Catherine's grandmother, and Robert. Money was always tight. Thomas worked long hours. Catherine raised 4 children in a small rented apartment, taking in sewing and laundry to supplement income. But by all accounts, Catherine and Thomas created a warm, loving home, the opposite of Catherine's own childhood. Catherine kept only a few possessions from her early life. One was the 1903 photograph of herself and Eleanor. She treasured it intensely. She showed it to her children and later grandchildren, always describing it the same way. "This is me with my grandmother Eleanor, who I loved very much. This was taken right before she died. It's my favorite photograph because it reminds me of when I was happy." Catherine's children and grandchildren always interpreted this literally, a photograph of a living grandmother and happy granddaughter, taken shortly before the grandmother's death. No one realized Catherine was posing with a corpse. No one knew Catherine had been sent away 3 weeks later. No one understood that Catherine's description, "It reminds me of when I was happy," referred not to the moment of the photograph, but to the brief period before March 1903 when her father was alive. Her mother was stable. Her grandmother was alive. And Catherine still had a family. That photograph captured the last moment before everything collapsed. The last day Catherine held someone's hand and smiled before spending the rest of her childhood unwanted. Catherine O'Brien died in 1982 at age 86. She was a devoted mother and grandmother. By all accounts, despite her difficult childhood, she was warm, loving, and created strong bonds with her family, determined to give her children the love and stability she never had. The photograph of Catherine and Eleanor was passed to Catherine's daughter Margaret, then to Margaret's daughter Patricia, then to Patricia's daughter Emma, the woman who brought it to Jennifer Walsh for restoration in 2021. For 118 years, 4 generations treasured the photograph as a sweet family memory. None suspected the truth until digital restoration revealed what the camera had captured, but time had hidden. When Emma Richardson learned the truth about the 1903 photograph, She experienced a complex mix of emotions: shock, horror, sadness, and strangely, a deeper understanding of her great-grandmother, Catherine. "I grew up hearing stories about great-grandma Catherine," Emma explained. She was described as incredibly loving, but also intensely private about her childhood. She never talked about her parents or her early life. When asked, she would change the subject or give vague answers. "We always assumed it was just because those times were hard, or she didn't remember much." Now Emma understood why Catherine had been reluctant to discuss her childhood. The photograph she treasured wasn't actually a happy memory. It was the last remnant of a childhood that ended traumatically when she was 7 years old. Emma contacted the Springfield Historical Society and Massachusetts State Archives to research the Miller family history further. She found Eleanor Miller's death certificate, March 8, 1903, heart failure. Martha Miller's death certificate, June 15, 1911, pulmonary tuberculosis. Census records showing Catherine living with the Henderson family in Hartford from 1905 to 1915. No official record of Martha giving up Catherine. Informal arrangements like this were common and often undocumented. Emma also discovered something that explained the photograph's composition. Photographer's studio records from Springfield, March 1903. The photographer's daybook included an entry: March 9th, Mrs. M. Miller, memorial portrait, residence service, $3.50. $3.50, approximately $115 in today's money. For a widow seamstress in 1903, this represented perhaps a week's wages or more. Martha had spent desperately needed money on this photograph. But why include Catherine? Why pose the 7-year-old girl with her dead grandmother? Emma found a possible answer in a letter discovered in Patricia's, Emma's grandmother's, belongings. The letter, written by Catherine to her daughter Margaret in 1965, mentioned the photograph. "Your grandmother Eleanor was the kindest person I ever knew. When I was very small, she told me every day that I was loved and special. After she was gone, I forgot for many years what it felt like to be told that. The photograph of us together is precious to me, not because of the photograph itself, but because it reminds me she existed, that those feelings were real, that I wasn't imagining the love I felt when I was very young." Emma realized Martha had included Catherine in the post-mortem photograph not to deceive, but to create a final memorial of Eleanor and Catherine's bond. Martha knew Catherine would be sent away. She knew Catherine's childhood was ending. She wanted Catherine to have physical proof, photographic evidence, that Eleanor had existed, that the love Catherine remembered was real. The photograph wasn't meant to fool Catherine into thinking Eleanor was alive. It was meant to preserve memory after everything else was lost. Jennifer Walsh published an article about the discovery in the Journal of Historical Photography in 2022, using the Miller family photograph as a case study in post-mortem photography and digital restoration, revealing hidden historical details. The article sparked broader discussion about Victorian death practices, childhood grief, and the complicated ethics of post-mortem photography involving children. For Emma, the revelation transformed her understanding of the photograph. "It's no longer a happy family portrait," she said. "It's evidence of love persisting through unbearable loss. It's sadder than I ever imagined. But it's also more meaningful." The 1903 photograph of Catherine and Eleanor Miller now resides in the Springfield History Museum in Massachusetts, part of an exhibit on Victorian death practices and memorial photography. The museum display includes the original photograph, Jennifer Walsh's digital restoration showing the post-mortem details, historical context about post-mortem photography, and the Miller family's story researched by Emma Richardson. The exhibit caption reads, "This photograph, taken March 9, 1903, shows 7-year-old Catherine Rose Miller posing with her grandmother, Eleanor Miller, approximately 24 hours after Eleanor's death." The practice of post-mortem photography was common in the Victorian and Edwardian eras, particularly among working-class families who could not afford photographs during their loved ones' lifetimes. What makes this photograph particularly poignant is that Catherine's mother, Martha, recently widowed and facing poverty, included her daughter in this memorial portrait, knowing Catherine would soon be sent to live with relatives. The photograph served as Catherine's only tangible memory of her grandmother and her early childhood. Catherine kept this photograph throughout her 86-year life, describing it as her favorite photograph because it reminded her of when she was happy. For 118 years, the photograph's true nature remained hidden due to fading and damage. Digital restoration in 2021 revealed the subtle signs of post-mortem photography invisible in the original print. This image represents not just Victorian death practices, but the resilience of love and memory in the face of overwhelming loss. Emma Richardson donated additional Miller family documents to the museum: Martha's death certificate, the photographer's receipt, Catherine's letter to Margaret, and census records documenting Catherine's displacement. "I wanted the full story preserved," Emma explained. "Not just the photograph, but the context. These were real people facing impossible circumstances. Martha wasn't being morbid or cruel by including Catherine in a post-mortem photograph. She was doing the only thing she could to preserve love in the face of total loss." The exhibit has become one of the museum's most visited displays. Many visitors are moved to tears. Some share their own family stories of loss, displacement, or treasured photographs with hidden meanings. In 2023, Emma worked with a genealogist to locate living descendants of Catherine's siblings. She discovered 12 living relatives who had never known the full Miller family story. Several attended a memorial service at Springfield Cemetery, where Eleanor and Martha are buried, finally placing proper headstones with their names. The headstone for Eleanor reads, "Eleanor Patterson Miller, 1835 to 1903, beloved grandmother, remembered through love." The headstone for Martha reads, "Martha Miller, 1871 to 1911, beloved mother who sacrificed everything." Emma visits the graves occasionally, bringing flowers. "I never met Catherine. She died when my mother was young. But knowing her story has changed how I see my own life. She survived childhood trauma, built a loving family, and never lost her capacity for love despite everything. That's extraordinary." The photograph itself remains what it always was: a 7-year-old girl holding her grandmother's hand, smiling at the camera, capturing a fraction of a second in 1903 when love existed before loss. Sometimes a photograph captures exactly what it appears to show: happiness, love, family. And sometimes it captures something far more complex: the moment before everything changes, preserved forever, misunderstood for 118 years until technology reveals the truth. But perhaps understanding the truth doesn't diminish the photograph's meaning. Perhaps it deepens it. Because love doesn't require the living. Love persists in memory, in photographs, in stories passed down through generations. Eleanor loved Catherine. Catherine remembered that love for 79 years after Eleanor's death. And now, 121 years later, we remember both of them. Sometimes that's enough. Sometimes that's everything.